Welcome everybody and good afternoon from Oxford. I'm William Lee, the Business Development Manager for the Oxford CIO Academy, one of the open programmes at Saïd Business School, University of Oxford. Thank you for joining us today for what should be a fascinating webinar. Professor Michael Earl, Programme Director of the Oxford CIO Academy, will be discussing being IT ready for mergers and acquisitions, focusing specifically on post-merger integration and the challenges that brings. Michael has extensive experience in IT strategy, strategic management and IT leadership, as well as international management and, of course, acquisitions and mergers. His recent research has been on IT in post-merger integration and rethinking information as a strategic resource. Throughout today's webinar, please do submit your questions and comments via the question dialog box on your screen. But without further ado, I give you Professor Michael Earl.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. You may wonder why I think of a title about "Are you IT ready for mergers and acquisitions?" And the simple answer is this, that mergers and acquisitions seem to be on the rise again. Whereas on the one hand, mergers and acquisitions are seen to rarely work out as intended. And indeed, financial economists tend to suggest that 70% of M&A fail if you set the benchmark as what might have happened without the merger or without the acquisition. Furthermore, it's often suggested that about 50% of mergers and acquisitions destroy value in the two companies or two organizations. They don't add value. The only exceptional perspective on this is that you can do quite well if you are the seller. If you are the acquired, you can do quite well financially because you probably managed to sell for more than the deal was worth. But generally speaking, it's a tragic story. But as I mentioned right at the beginning, the corporate appetite for mergers and acquisitions fades only intermittently. And last year, it's estimated that the global value of M&A was something in the order of $5 trillion. An average over the last 10 years or so suggests that it's somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion. And the forecasts for next year and the year beyond go even higher. So if one looks at corporate plans right now, according to a recent report by Ernst & Young, then 57% of large firms are actively considering some form of acquisition or merger. More than that, 49% of firms are looking at 5 or more possible deals, 5 or more candidate mergers. So what we see is there's more pursuit of mergers and acquisitions than there has been for a long time. And the reason for thinking about the question, are you IT ready, is therefore a merger or an acquisition can be arriving on the doorstep, as it were, as a possibility very quickly, and one needs to be thinking about what does this mean for IT. And from research that we've done in Oxford, we've established in the whole life cycle of mergers, which we'll look at in a few moments, it's at the post-merger integration stage that the main problem occurs. So one can have been scanning for a candidate, you can be doing due diligence and so forth, cementing the deal, but it's actually when you start to put the deal into practice that the problems come home. And it's at that point, at post-merger integration, that the CIO tends to become in the spotlight, because one is seeking to answer the question, where do we need to integrate our applications? Do we need to re-engineer our IT infrastructure? Are we wanting to integrate or have common processes. And all these things, of course, are very dependent upon the IT function. So it's the post-merger integration phase which is the main problem, because that's where the benefits and the synergies, or indeed the destruction of value of a merger, can take place. Now, prior phases of the merger and acquisition process can also be to blame, and we'll look at those at the moment. But it is post-merger integration which is nearly always cited by people who have lived through mergers as the crucial stage, quite often where things started to go wrong, or the delivery of synergies took much longer than expected, or one has had to have more than one project on the integration because the first one didn't work out. This is the delivery phase. It's where the rubber hits the road. So let's just stand back a moment to think about the life cycle of a merger or an acquisition. This is all straightforward, and most of you will recognize it. But the question is, in each of the stages of the life cycle, what's the question for the CIO and the IT function? Or what should be the question? So first of all, we've got the scanning stage. If you're a company who is on the lookout for acquisitions and mergers, in other words, you're doing scanning, or indeed, if you think you might be being bid for, you might be scanning for who might be after you. What do we need to think about from the IT point of view? Well, there's two perspectives, really. I mean, typically, a merger, let's just call everything a merger. Technically, a merger could be about a product fit. It could be about market fit or market expansion. It could be about efficiency and savings. In other words, we're usually in pursuit of some form of synergy where the 2 + 2 will make 5. And the question for IT is, here is how might IT hinder us delivering the synergy or the opportunity, or how might it help us? That's a pretty obvious question. But also there's one that seems to get overlooked very often, which is there some way in which IT could bring synergy opportunities we hadn't thought about? For example, could bringing two companies together create new sources of information, new information revenue opportunities? Could working off a new platform allow us to go into new markets that we hadn't thought about? Could we be acquiring a company which has got some special application which is seen to be full of competitive advantage, and we'd like to acquire that? So the IT question is not just how important is IT in delivering the synergies that have been espoused, but also can IT and information itself produce synergies and new opportunities for new business. Now, once one's identified candidates in the scanning phase, remember that quite often there can be 5 or more candidates being looked at. What about the due diligence? And typically there might be a corporate planning department in the company, the acquirer doing the due diligence, or you might be outsourcing it to a consultancy or one of the big 4 accounting firms. Now, what I found, both in my research and in my experience, is that the IT question gets very shallow attention in the due diligence phase. Quite often because it's a rapid phase and it takes time to understand what the IT situation looks like. But it's not unusual, with about 2 days to go in the due diligence phase, to get a phone call, and I speak personally here, get a phone call to say, is there anything you think we should know about this company and its IT capability? Or do you think there's any opportunities we haven't recognised in that company? Or even more than that, in the due diligence phase, what questions should we be asking? And if you think about what we just were talking about in the previous slide, about where things can go wrong, well, if we recognise it mainly goes wrong in the post-merger integration, can we anticipate what we've got to face up to in our due diligence? So, in my view, and from the evidence of our research, it's absolutely crucial that an IT voice, an IT capability, or an IT knowledge is employed in the due diligence phase. The next phase, of course, if you're going to actually try and go ahead with a acquisition or merger, is what about the deal? Now, the deal, of course, is finding the price. At the end of the day, as they always say, price is what the two parties will agree it is. It's a question of negotiation. But the thought to put into that pot is, has the IT function, presumably through the CIO, been asked to consider what might be the incremental costs involved for IT in bringing these companies together, and what sources of value might there be lurking by bringing those companies together. There could be value from IT savings, but there could be value from better exploitation of applications and processes you're acquiring. So it is important nowadays to recognise that the IT costs and the IT returns could influence the price at which you'd settle the deal. Then, if we've got a deal, we're into the integration stage, post-merger integration stage. This is where the horror stories are. In the research done here, and I know in research done in other business schools, it's been quite problematic to do the research because people haven't wanted to talk about the horror stories too much. So there isn't very much published on this topic. But what I can say from our research is there are 4 possible strategies for post-merger integration. And what I want to talk about mostly here on is about those 4 choices. And I'd like to open up a discussion, those of you on the webinar, about experiences of those choices. Now, let's just for the moment assume that we've got through all the post-merger integration. The final stage of the life cycle is the audit phase. And of course, one wants to do an analysis and an audit of how everything went and how did IT perform in the post-merger integration. But the real question that matters is, what did we learn from this if we have to go through it again? Some companies have a playbook. They do have a playbook for mergers and acquisitions. And I would suggest if you don't have one, it's worth starting one. And the important reason for having an audit stage is to say, now what have we learnt from this latest acquisition that we should add to our playbook of good practice and of aide-memoire of what we should be looking at. Because there is rapid learning by experience in the post-merger integration phase. So once we're faced with that, if we look at the next slide, the question is, how do you decide which way to go? So we have 4 possible strategies. They all begin with C. There isn't a 5th because I can't think of something else with a C. There's not a 5th because we found in our research that there were these 4 different ideal strategies or approaches to handling post-merger integration. And I will describe each one. And then, as I describe them, I'd like to invite those participating to suggest how do you decide which one to adopt. So the first one is the consolidation phase. That is to say, this is where you crash and smash the applications and the infrastructure of each company or each organization together into one. Effectively, it's an IT takeover. Not necessarily the outcome of a power battle, which I hope will conclude, but it might be. But it basically, the consolidation strategy says we're going to have one IT platform, one common applications portfolio. We'll crash and smash them together, do it as as possible and get the whole deal over with. So that's the consolidation strategy or approach. The second one is the combine approach. This can be thought of as almost as a merger of equals, in the sense you ask the question of the two organisations coming together, which has the better breed of an application or of an infrastructure component. So it's looking for the better of two and going for a selection process. And it doesn't necessarily have to be 50% of one and 50% of the other's IT applications, but it's trying to get the best of both worlds by looking for the best of breed merger of equals. The third one we call the coexist approach or strategy, and this is essentially where you hardly change anything. So company A keeps its systems and applications, company B keeps its systems and applications. They may well each run on their own separate infrastructure unless there's some economies of scale bring them together. And the only perhaps new applications that might be developed across the two organisations might be those that are collecting the financial numbers. So not a lot changes from what went on before. If you like, you can think of this as the as-is strategy. The final approach or strategy we call the create one, which is to say that we will create a completely new applications portfolio. We'll create a completely new infrastructure. This is something we need to do to bring the companies together for whatever reason, and basically we're going to start again. This clearly is perhaps the biggest in terms of work of the four strategies. Now, in our research, we identified how you might decide which way to go, but I thought it might be interesting just for a few moments to ask the question of those participating from their experience, how do you decide which of these four approaches or strategies to adopt? So we'll stop for a minute and hope that one or two people volunteer their experience and answers. Whether they do or not, we'll then do an analysis.
Yes, we've had one comment come in saying it could depend on 1, size difference, 2, the business overlap, and 3, the status of existing applications landscape.
Okay, well, yes, it might. I think those are all pretty valid. The size question, I think, is valid if you've got a big disparity, and you know, typically, actually, if there's a big disparity, it's the large company that wins. It's not necessarily the right answer, but that's just the convenient and manageable answer, and possibly the least costly. The question of how, what was it on applications? How
status of existing applications landscape.
Yes. So, I mean, we'll come back to this. One's going to be hoped that the decision about applications is, as it were, business-driven, related to the goals of the merger. But then you are going to be looking at two sets of applications, and that's where most of that sort of work happens when you've decided you're going to go for the combined strategy. And the second suggestion was about.
Stick on that one. So we had size difference, business overlap,
Yeah.
status of existing application landscape.
Yeah, business overlap. Yes, one has to agree with that. I'm going to drill down at a different level on that, but it would seem fairly obvious if there was not a great business overlap, you wouldn't really go for too much on the combining and the consolidation. You might be thinking about coexisting. The question will arise, however, if there isn't too much of an overlap, why you're going for the merger, and the general answer would be you're following some sort of conglomerate journey, and you're believing that either through financial engineering or better management there's going to be some gain from the merger. Over the long run, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that doesn't materialise. The conglomerate sort of path, other than through financial engineering, is not usually been seen to be a good recipe. But each of those three factors do apply, and I will develop them in slightly different language in a moment. So any other...
Yes, a couple of other comments. We've had one that says also relative strength of the acquirer versus the acquired.
Yeah.
And then another comment is fielding the best solution seems to be the predominating choice, but doesn't always tend to work.
Yes. Well, the strength question is really a power answer, isn't it? And it exists in the real world. And it may not actually be the most rational answer, but it's not necessarily the worst answer. The worst answer is going for an approach which you can't manage very well and it takes forever. And we have seen companies dither about what to do. We had a famous case study where after 8 years the strategy hadn't been chosen and the synergies were diluting so fast that what was now coming on the table was, should we divest again? So strength can be, as it were, the means to an end sometimes, but it's not the most rational way of looking at it.
We've also had a comment saying that the complexity of each service versus resulting opportunity and cost value drives the decision to integrate in one of those four ways.
Yeah. And the more complex the situation is, the more likely one's going to go for the, as it were, power approach of consolidation, or let sleeping dogs lie approach of coexist. And that might, both those may seem weak answers, but it's all about manageability. And that can be a legitimate strategy for a time, but then quite often you find you need to rethink. But there's no harm in that.
That's all the comments for now. So
Okay,
if we
move on then, thank you for those who've given us your thoughts, which is very helpful. And I think you recognise those thoughts in this particular framework, which is coming up right now. So we have our four possible strategies, and from our research it looked like how you might choose which way to go depends on where you sit on these two axes, on the x-axis and the y-axis, if you will. So on the left-hand side you see that we talk about IT-enabled synergies, which is to say, how much does the synergy that you're hoping will result from the merger or acquisition, how much does the 2 + 2 = 5 depend upon IT delivery and on the IT platform? And then on the other axis, or the x-axis, what we would see is, as somebody suggested, it depends on the landscape, the IT landscape. I think the words used were application landscape, but we're saying it depends on the state of the underpinning IT infrastructure. That is to say, do you think you can do what you want to do on the existing infrastructure, or somehow have you got to start again with some bits, at least large bits or amount of new IT infrastructure? So if we think about where we are in these on this grid, remember that we'll start in the top. The consolidate is the crash and smash together, more or less an IT takeover. And this is often adopted where IT really underpins the synergies sought. And you're looking for efficiency of IT, perhaps savings in IT, or you're looking for common processes, or you're trying to integrate your product range or your distribution channels, or indeed your geographies. And you see this absolutely necessary is to have a common platform. But if possible, if you can get away with it, you may well be saying, but we don't want to rebuild unless we have to. And if you feel then that you can work on your existing infrastructure, or whichever parties it is, the consolidate approach might be right. And you end up with a common IT portfolio and a shared infrastructure. And it might matter most where speed of integration matters. It's the brutal approach sometimes, and it's not to say it's easy, but it does suggest you throw a lot of resources at this. So this is really about synergies being dependent on IT, and about can we do it with one of our with either of our two existing infrastructures. So what do we need to do to make it work? Well, it is a big project. In fact, it's a big program. So you need very visible and continuous top management involvement and commitment. You can't afford to deviate from this strategy. Preferably, you'd have a new executive committee between the two organisations, or executive board, and they will be responsible for overseeing the consolidation. You may even appoint a director or senior vice president at board level of the integration project, because this is big time. And you're just trying to make sure that the IT is dependable, and that you meet the deadlines, there's no drift. So why do I say that? It's because in this situation that vested interests are at stake, and there will be manageability questions. And the more you're having to negotiate and you're having to make changes, the more opportunity there is for those vested interests to get debated and pursued, or for people to resist. So this is why in the consolidating strategy you need very clear top management governance, and then very heavy duty project management, using all the tools available. If we come to the view that the hoped for synergies are not IT dependent to a large degree, and there's nothing wrong with the infrastructures we've got, then we might well go for the coexist strategy. Here, the merger is not necessarily, or the acquisition, about particular big synergies probably. It's an as-is approach. But what you do want to make sure is that the systems don't break down or for some reason perform worse than they did when you had two separate companies. And that's about the sum total, other than it might be necessary to have one or two common shared corporate systems, classically on financial reporting and sometimes on HR matters, particularly on identifying and developing talent. So much of the governance, and indeed it's very small, but much of the government can be given to a corporate IT policy committee or a steering committee and left to IT to get on with it. It's not the same big business program as it is under consolidation. And the project management can stay at the level of each individual application. So this is the low-key approach. We go back to the top on the right-hand side. The create is saying, yes, we are pursuing very IT-dependent synergies. Indeed, it may all be about IT and information. And what we're perhaps trying to do is to make a bit business opportunities out of our information we collect and process, and about our IT channels and platforms. and we need to be creating an infrastructure of quite a different order than we've had before in the two organisations. We want the organisations to work together. It's about information sharing, about knowledge sharing, about customer sharing, and so forth. So we better create a new infrastructure. So this, in some ways, is the riskiest of the approach in terms of ambition. It is starting new. It's also betting on a new vision, on an information or an IT vision, as the business strategy. The business strategy and the IT strategy become one. So the governance challenge is this. It ain't going to work unless the executive board, the business board, are driving it. And they've got to be really engaged in it. They've got to own it. And it could be that you then say, wait a minute, we've got to keep our two businesses running while we develop this new business. And one approach on Create, therefore, is to have a team with its own CIO doing all the new building, the Create, and another team with another CIO keeping the show running with the old applications. That's the problem with mergers and acquisitions. You can't stop the current business while you're building the new one. So this is another reason why the Create can be one of the riskiest approaches. Not one, the riskiest. We're now left with the Combine approach. If you remember, this is the merger of equals, where we might have a rubric, as it were, of seeking the better breed of the two. But of course, once you do that, that gives oxygen, that gives opportunity for everybody to claim they've got the best application, the best bit of infrastructure. They can pursue their vested interests. So you do need to have a team overseeing this, a project management team that's looking at all aspects of this, making business-oriented decisions about which is the better breed, not just IT ones. You need a really good business and IT rubric for doing it. You need a project leader who's got good business sense, who can see beyond the IT, see the business implications, who have political nous to be able to favour one side of the merger in one area and another one on another, and who can be good on conflict resolution when it happens. And really what's quite important is to have a very clear, simple vision that everybody buys into, so that you can go back to a higher level in trying to resolve conflicts between who has the better application. Sometimes it can be done quite simply. I remember in one of our cases, which was in a European bank where two banks had come together, part of the rationale was that one bank, which was essentially a domestic bank, wanted to increase its international reach, and the other bank, which was an international bank, felt it could do better things domestically. So they, quite simply, they just said, let's use companies A's systems infrastructure for domestic banking and companies B's for the international banking. Now that decision is really made simple by having very clear business vision. But there is a real risk in the Combine if you take too long on the decision making and therefore the politics, that you dilute the delivery of the synergies to a point where the merger will join those 70% that fail to deliver the anticipated returns. So occasionally you might have to be willing to be pragmatic on one or two decisions on the Combine to stop that time dilution. But then we have four possible approaches, and I hope people will agree that what came out when those of you who had experienced this said, well, it depends on the technology landscape, it depends on the commonality of the business. It's sort of saying the same, but we have a fairly clear picture of which way to jump when you're faced with integration. Now, the interesting observation to add to this is you can be thinking of this at the scanning stage and at the due diligence stage. this is a very good way of informing you what is going to be the scope and the risk, the IT scope and risk of the acquisition before you actually start the integration. So it's worth having in your back pocket, as it were, as a way of thinking about the IT implications when you're looking at candidates and when you're doing due diligence. Both areas which I've suggested quite often get, IT gets forgotten in. So there's a framework to think about. Those who've lived through mergers and acquisitions very often are quite clear on what are the few success factors that are required in post-merger IT integration. So this is where I'd like to invite those participating to offer their thoughts on what are the 1, 2 or 3 critical success factors in any post-merger IT integration. And as before, I'll step in at a point and suggest to you what's come out of our research as 6 critical success factors. So I'm hoping 1 or 2 of you are bursting to suggest from your own lessons of experience what they might be.
Whilst we wait for those answers to come in, there was a question that we had, just going back to the previous slide, saying create is so much easier to implement but requires strong management. Management strength is a key factor in choosing the approach. How do you fit this in?
In the create approach?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, in a sense, how do we fit it in? I think I did emphasise that because it's, in some ways the risk is, it has to have very strong commitment and involvement from top management, really grounded in a very believable vision of why we're doing this. If the business vision is clear, then it becomes harder to argue that you shouldn't be creating new stuff. Now, the real challenge from our research suggests that if you're having to keep the business running as well as develop the new IT platform for the new business, it's quite resource intensive. And you may be having to spend much more than you anticipated. For example, it wouldn't be unusual to do an outsourcing deal for the existing applications portfolio infrastructure and develop the new stuff in-house. But that's an incremental cost. So very strong visionary, if you like, governance and very strong project management and careful attention to budgets is, I think, what jumps out of that particular approach.
We've also had a comment saying that with a merger of equals, it seems the choice would often be combine at highest level and consolidate or create at application process level.
Yeah, I think that's plausible. I think there's a question quite often gets asked is there just one approach? And sometimes you can be in a situation where you want to combine to start off with, but know that no particular application will be perfect. So in due course you may be into create. And equally, you might say you will coexist for a time till you really learn what the situation is like on the ground. Because despite what I've said, actually, due diligence is quite difficult on this front. So you might have a period of coexist before you decide which of the other 3 approaches to adopt.
Going on to our current slide, we've had just one answer so far, and that is strong management. Mm-hmm. So if anyone else has any other comments on that, please do let us know. Otherwise, Michael, would you like to reveal the secret?
Well, we certainly don't want weak management. But I've made a sort of distinction in each of those boxes between what sort of governance do you need. I mean, governance is really about decision making across across organisations. And here we've got 2 organisations. So it's a governance question, and that's where you need one common board, either an IT board or better still the business board making decisions. Then you need heavy duty management at the programme or project level. That's what I'm really trying to say.
We've had another comment through just saying a few points here. An important point would be no increased security vulnerability. Client experiences are not adversely affected by the move. Third point, systems should be stable, and then maintenance and support costs contained. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah, the stability question I think is important. That's why some companies going through mergers will settle for the period of coexist, make sure everything's all right, and then start again. And the previous point was lost, but it was actually incredibly relevant. Can you just read them out again?
So yeah, sure. And increased security vulnerability. Client experiences are not adversely affected by the move.
That's the one, the client experiences. It leads to another thought. It's not going to be directly on my list in a moment, but actually thinking about the customer does matter. And so keeping customers informed of what's going on and even seeking ideas from customers is no bad thing. And I've lived through in my practical experience leading a merger, and one of the big turning points and the big value-added points is where we brought the customers into deciding what to do. And of course, the more that IT reaches out into distribution channels, into supply chain, into alliances, there's a strong case for that. At worst, you don't want to screw up your customers, and at best, you want to get some ideas and opinions from your customers. So the client experience, as the question put it, I think really matters. So here we are. What, from our research, has come out as six success factors in the post-merger integration phase. Well, the first one, not surprisingly, is to think about your integration strategy, to have, as it were, a strategic analytical picture, which is where our 2x2 matrix comes in. There are choices, and if you can articulate the business reason for the merger and acquisition, and if you can assess the technological change on the other axis, then you've got a good chance of making a sensible choice of strategy. You very often hear business people as well as IT people just say, well, what you've got to do is to consolidate as soon as possible and not mess about. That is not a universal strategy. And if you're not sure what the strategy is, then as I've hinted at, there's a case for going for coexist until you're clear about what's the right way to go. Time. All our organisations we've analysed stress the point that time matters in post-merger integration. It matters because you can lose your synergies and the value you hoped for from the merger. It matters if you're struggling and dithering because you might lose your key talent. It matters because if you don't get on with it, people lose confidence in the merger. And this is especially true if actually your overall mission is growth by acquisition. If it's growth by acquisition, you don't want to be slowing down your acquisition implementation. So sometimes you'll decide to do not pretty things, to take the ugly answer in order to be timely, and then reverse engineer a good answer a bit later on. But in terms of project management to put into it, as somebody asked, the conventional time boxing, milestones, project management, crucial. Otherwise, time just drifts. Now, if we were going to be here longer, I would say, what would people vote was the most important of these success factors? Well, our research says understanding culture. there's 3 levels of culture to think about. One is obvious, the organisational culture. Every organisation has its culture. It's highly likely that the other party's culture is different. If it's different, they'll behave differently, they'll talk differently, they'll take decisions differently, they may have different values. So we've got to understand those. Then there's sector cultures. So if you're moving into a different sector, or if you're going through the conglomerate approach, you've got to understand the sector cultures. But above all, what came out of research is national culture. National cultures are different. I've done research on national culture and its influence on IT decision making. Very different. And it takes time to understand those differences. So if you've got trans-border post-merger integration, analyse the culture, take time to live with it before you choose your strategy. Nearly everybody in the merger business, whether they're in IT, whether they're general managers, whether they're in marketing, whatever it is, will say quite simply, it's about communication, communication, communication. And really, continuous, frequent communication is important to keep convincing people of the benefits, to report progress, to celebrate successes, to help increase the faith, and of course to identify new ideas and to recognise problems that happen and tackle them there and then. In fact, it's important to bring about cultural integration that we've just glossed over rather. So communication, multi-level, external and internal, and very much in business language, not in IT speak. Most of you, I think, will recognise PMO as Programme Management Office or organisation. These mergers and acquisitions are not projects, they're programmes. It's large change, it's multi-project, it's complex, there's interdependencies, and there will people who will want to resist change. And it's not just IT, it's processes, it's behaviours, it's controls, it's work design and so forth. So one needs to treat it as a project, as a programme rather, full of projects with a project management office. And preferably with a project management board comprising executives from across the piece, of course, including IT, and preferably chaired by the CEO or the COO. And finally, learning. So I stressed earlier the wisdom of audits, not only for checking progress, but for learning next time and developing a playbook. And learning from each organisation. Each organisation is likely to have some surprises, not just in terms of shocks, but potential benefits you hadn't recognised in due diligence phase. So it's important in all you do, you're looking out for new ideas and new opinions. So thinking of learning. And if you're one of those companies who might be entering mergers and acquisitions in the first time, are you IT ready? I think it's well worth developing your initial playbook of what you think is the best practice, and I'm going to suggest to you, we've covered quite a lot of that, and then you'll build on it by experience. Playbooks are pretty important in this area, so you don't have to keep relearning.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now it's just an opportunity for anyone who has any questions about what we've just heard. Please do submit them through the dialogue box on your screen. I think that we had a question from earlier, which I might just have a quick look at now. Basically, it was asking, looking at the slide that we focusing on earlier, how to decide which of these strategies to take. Well, the question is, this slide assumes you only are following one of these strategies. Should the target organisation have grown through acquisition, you could be picking up the pieces from prior M&A. Could it result in you having to adopt all of these strategies to varying degrees?
It might. And if you if you were, I think the important thing is you understand the rationale for that, for each one. No, the two axes help here. But it may well be, and it's the argument about going for coexist sometime. If you've inherited all these and you've kept all the different portfolios and platforms, there will become a time when you want to reverse engineer and simplify it and look for IT-related synergies from those and make a better job. And then you'll start to think about, can we select just one or two of those strategies using the analytical grid. But certainly it's not unusual to have two strategies for a time. And our case study companies have very much suggested, if you're in that area where you've got big cultural differences, particularly country cultural differences, a period of coexist to understand each other pays off. Then start to think about whether you're into consolidation, combine, create, or leave things as they are.
Another question that we've had through, just looking at final slide, was PMO is about the overall merger, or is it focused on IT related matters?
No, overall. Absolutely essential is overall. So that you've thought about all the independencies, the interaction of IT and everything else, and so that when you've got the difficult decisions, you've got a high level rubric called what's the business vision or what's the synergy. Absolutely essential.
Thank you for that. If anyone else has any more questions, please do send them through. Whilst we're waiting for any questions to come through, what I might do is just spend a bit of time just briefly looking at the programme, the Oxford CIO Academy. Just we have the timetable in front of us, and just say that basically the programme is a unique 4-day leadership experience for executives responsible, senior executives responsible for IT strategy. Past participants have included CIOs, CTOs, IT directors, heads of IT, just to name a few. The programme is incredibly diverse. We have participants coming from all parts of the world, from a whole host of varied companies, including the Cardi, United Nations, Santander, the Prince's Trust. Just to quickly run through the timetable day by day. So the first day, we look at the digital landscape. This focusing on the current demands on the IT function and the challenges for the CIO. On this day, all participants will have the opportunity to share their experiences with their classmates. Day 2 focuses on strategic perspectives, where we will focus on topical subjects such as cybersecurity and big data, whilst contemplating upcoming major technologies. Day 3, we examine CIO leadership, where you will have an opportunity to review your own leadership style and approach through psychometric testing. And then on the final day, the emphasis is on making IT happen, where you look at how CIOs can successfully work with their CEO and ensure that the IT strategy is fully ingrained in the organization's strategy. Indeed, Michael recently ran a CIO Insider Outsider webinar, which can be found on our website. All of these sessions on the timetable are taught by world-class academics from both the business school and the university. We also have a selection of practitioners from leading IT-focused organisations such as Gartner, who will be teaching on the programme. So going back to the questions, Michael, what do you think the primary consideration will be in 10 years' time for merging systems? Will it be easier with the growing influence of decentralisation, digital and the cloud?
That's a very good question. I suppose it's $1 million question, really. I'm not sure I have an answer in which I could put a lot of confidence in. My hunch is this, that I've been in IT a long time. There's always something going on which makes life easier to some degree. For some purposes, for example, cloud has made things easier. On the other hand, there's always new stuff coming along. And so if we look at the situation now, we've got cloud, we've got a lot of do-it-yourself stuff going on in tablets. On the other hand, we worry about cyber security, and we're not even sure we know what technologies are being used in our organisation and how they link up with anything as regards the Internet of Things and digitisation. I think we're in for a period of all that for at least another 10 years. So I don't think M&A, from a technology point of view, is going to get any easier. Some bits will be easier than they used to be, but there are other new challenges coming along. Now, if that depresses you, it shouldn't, because it's actually saying what an interesting game this is and what a privilege it is to be a CIO.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michael, for that. I think maybe, just looking at time, we can just wrap up now with the final slide. This again, just giving some brief information about the programme. Just to let you know, the programme does run twice a year, and the next cohort is fast approaching, so the 6th to the 9th of December. We do still have places left. It's based at our residential campus on the outskirts of Oxford. The fee, as you can see on the screen, is $5,750, which includes accommodation. For further information, including how to apply, just need to contact my colleague, Zinti Cresswell, whose details are in front of you. Zinti and myself will be delighted to answer any questions that you may have, and equally we'd be very happy to put you in touch with past participants. So thank you again very much, Michael, for the webinar today, and of course thank you to all of our listeners out there.
Yes, thank you, participants and listeners.